Please welcome to the platform Neil Hamilton.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be back in Eastbourne, where I made my very first speech from a UKIP conference platform back in 2011. I've been a member of UKIP since 2002, but I've been fighting the battle for Britain for a good deal longer than that, because I joined the Anti-Common Market League in 1967. So I was in at the start of this fight, and I intend to be in at the finish. But in those years in the late 60s, there were other issues which were just starting to be discussed, and one of them was the environment. I can remember when the environment was invented as a political issue. And of course, the great fear at that time was global cooling. The scientists and the scientific journals and their political offshoots at that time were all talking about the coming ice age and how we'd have woolly mammoths wandering around on the downs of Sussex and so on if we didn't do something about it. In the course of a long life in politics, I've seen many fads and fancies come and go. And I reflect on the truth of an old political adage that politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and then applying the wrong remedy. And now we live in an age of another fad and fancy called global warming. Now, one of the many changes that have taken place in my lifetime in Britain is the collapse of organized religion. In the old days, we used all to go to church on Sundays, go up to the communion rail and drink from the communion cup. Now, of course, people go to the recycling centre, the bottle bank, and commune together there. So, of course, times change, but this has much, much wider consequences than what we do in our private observances, because governments all over the world are now enslaved by this idea, somehow or other, that the planet is going to incinerate itself within, well, if you believe the most extreme of these advocates, like Theresa May and the British government, then by 2030 it's all up, mate, so it doesn't really matter whether we leave the EU or not, because we'll all be dead by then anyway, frazzled to a crisp by global warming. But let's be serious about this. What we are witnessing in the various policies that the British government are taking the lead in, actually, around the world, what the British government is doing is, what we're seeing is the biggest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich that has occurred, I think, since pre-revolutionary France. And because it's the poor that are paying for these policies, of course, in various different ways, whether it's through your electricity bills or whether it's through more expensive fuel, whether you turn that into heating or in your car for transport, and in many other ways as well. And the beneficiaries of this through the subsidies that are imposed upon us, through the tax system and the charges imposed upon energy companies, of course, are the multimillionaire developers of wind farms, solar panel parks, and all the rest of it. And so huge amounts of money are now being filched from your pockets and being put into the wallets of people, not necessarily British people, in fact, usually not British people, because most of the companies developing these wind farms are actually from other parts of the world. In the process, of course, we've seen in Wales, first and foremost, we've seen this, a massive change in the kind of work which people do. When I was growing up in Wales, we had a coal industry and a steel industry. That's virtually disappeared. The coal industry has completely disappeared. And where have these jobs gone to? Well, they've gone to China, they've gone to India, and to other parts of the world. And what we've done in Wales is to replace jobs that were very well paid. Coal miners and steel workers were very well paid compared with most other working class jobs, and we've now replaced them with 0 hours contracts, burger bar operators, and so on and so forth, and low paid jobs. 23% or 23% of the households in Wales are actually in fuel poverty. People are paying more than 10% of their incomes just to keep warm or keep the lights on in their homes. So these are the people who are most vulnerable in society, and yet these are the people who have been deliberately targeted as though you had a bomb aimer in Whitehall who was deciding who we could most eviscerate through the tax system and the charging system. And of course, the great cheerleaders for all this are those left-wing parties like the Labour Party, which supposedly came into existence in order to promote the cause of working people and promote the interests of the poor. These are the people who are loading them down with the greatest possible burdens. We are actually impoverishing the poor as a deliberate act of government policy. You may say that you'd expect that from the Conservative Party, but you certainly wouldn't expect it from the Labour Party or the Lib Dems. But there it is. Jobs in coal, steel, aluminium, glass, concrete, all the industries that use huge amounts of power in order to make the products that they sell have now moved from Britain, along with much the rest of manufacturing industry, to other parts of the world where they sign up to meaningless slogans which are written by the UN and then merrily go along their way, ignoring them and enriching themselves in the process. I have no problem with them enriching themselves so long as it isn't at our expense. The Climate Change Act, which was put through in 2008, it was, you remember that man, Ed Miliband from Wallace and Gromit? Well, the Climate Change Act, 2008, in the preamble to that bill, the cost was estimated at £720 billion over the next 25 years. That's 5 years the cost of the NHS. The cost of the Climate Change Act, which committed us for the first time to reducing carbon emissions in this country to 80% of what they were in 1990. The cost to you and me, £720 billion. And the people who are going to pay the biggest part of that price are those on the lowest incomes. Now, only a few weeks ago, Theresa May, because she's keen to have a legacy apparently, decided that we were going to up that target to carbon zero by 2050, so that we would have no net CO2 emissions at all. Well, that's going to be quite difficult because every time we breathe out, of course, we breathe CO2. So logically speaking, if you're carbon neutral, you have to get rid of all the people. Well, there are certain people I would like to get rid of. So maybe we'll have a competition for this as to who we get rid of first. And Theresa May says that she wants to take the lead in carbon emissions. So I'll take that as me first. And that would be a fine legacy indeed. So I think perhaps I'll write along those lines. But wind energy and solar energy are intermittent. I don't know whether the policymakers have noticed. The wind doesn't always blow, and it doesn't blow constantly. Sometimes it blows not at all. Sometimes it blows too much for the wind turbines to be able to operate. And in Britain, in spite of global warming, not every day is a sunny day. And therefore, solar energy is also not going to be the answer to our problem. We've got to have backup power. The national grid has to operate 24 hours a day. If you want to boil your kettle in the middle of the night, then you need the electricity in order to do it. And that can't come from wind power or solar power because we haven't got huge batteries that are capable of storing the electricity which can be generated during the day or during periods of time when there is no wind or when the sun isn't shining. Therefore, we have to have a backup fuel. And 50% of all the electricity which is generated in Britain today is by gas. Because we don't generate from coal anymore, nuclear is gradually declining, and therefore it's only gas which can make up the shortfall. And of course, most of that comes from Russia or the Ukraine. And therefore, there are geopolitical consequences which that brings into play as well. And wind energy is only about 20% efficient. So when you spend £250,000 to put up a wind turbine, 300 foot high or whatever it is, that's what they cost roughly, about £250,000 each. And they generate possibly 1 megawatt of power. We are looking at an energy source which can never cope with the scale of the demands of a modern industrial country like Britain, because they operate at 20% efficiency. So that for every pound that it costs you to develop a wind farm, it's only going to develop 20%, only going to be generating 20% of the potential electricity if it were able to operate 24 hours a day. So it's a hugely expensive way of generating electricity. And the corollary of that is you're then building up the backup power stations that you're going to have to switch off at different parts of the day when the wind turbines are capable of generating electricity. So you're doubling your capital cost in order to produce a much less efficient form of generation. But it isn't just, about the electricity that you use at home, because that actually is not the major part of the power that we use. So in committing yourself to carbon neutrality, then you're doing far more than saying we're just going to change all our power stations so that the source of their energy is going to be wind or solar or hydroelectric or whatever, rather than coal or gas or nuclear. The national grid consumes about 98 the power industries that are using electricity use about 100 megatons. Sorry, I'm getting this wrong around. In terms of carbon emissions, industry generates about 100 megatons of carbon dioxide a year. Business generally, about 66 megatons. Transport is 121 megatons. In our homes, we are generating about 66 megatons a year. Agriculture is 6, and industry generally is 10. So if you're going to be carbon neutral, not only are you going to have to cease to use fossil fuels in power stations, but we're going to have to stop having barbecues, for example, in the garden. In fact, Michael Gove the other day said that he was going to ban things like propane and other gases that can be used for barbecues, and you won't be able to burn wood chips either. Although one of the madnesses of the modern power regime is that we're actually cutting down the rainforest in Africa and in South America in order to turn the wood into chips that are then shipped halfway around the world to the power stations on the Humber in the North Sea. And this is madness on a grand scale indeed. And Britain is now making a major contribution towards the reduction of carbon emissions. But what difference does that make to the rest of the world? If we close down the entire United Kingdom economy, then we would reduce the world's global emissions by 1%. And in Wales, where the Welsh Labour government is even more manic about this than the UK government, Wales produces 0.01% or something like that of global emissions. So we could get rid of the entire population of Wales and close down all our industries, and we would make not a jot of difference to the rest of the world. But Wales has got a quarter of its population living in fuel poverty. So in order to wave a flag at international conferences in places like San Francisco or Cancun, they never seem to go to places like Scunthorpe to discuss their policies, do they? Then in order for our ministers to wave a flag in different parts of the world, the people of Britain are paying a very, very heavy price indeed. And it's even worse than that in a way. We produce 1% of global emissions. The United States produces 14%. And President Trump has very sensibly said he's not having any more of this nonsense. The USA has withdrawn from the climate change accords. India is producing 7% of the world's global emissions. China is producing 29%. So between them, China and India are producing 36% of all the CO2 emissions that are produced, and they're going hell for leather for more power from coal-fired power stations. They're opening one every single week. Last year alone, India increased the amount of CO2 it produces by 6.8%. Now, if we closed down the whole of Wales, then it didn't produce any carbon emissions at all, India would make up the shortfall in 10 weeks. That is the magnitude of Wales's contribution to fighting global warming. I haven't even started to talk about the science behind this, whether there's any justification for it at all. But even if you believe the global warming alarmists, why is it that we, who are not actually contributing very much to the problem, are paying a disproportionate amount in order to try to solve the problem? If it can't be a global solution, then there's no solution at all. All we're succeeding in doing is impoverishing our own country and marginalizing ourselves in the world and exporting the jobs of our people and the chances of a secure income to other parts of the world. And yet, when you look... When you look at what's happened in the last 100 years, when people say, the planet is warming as never before, if I were to ask you by how much the world has warmed since 1850, I wonder what you would say.
Less than 1 degree.
It's about 1 degree C, that's all. And the temperature in the last 50 years has warmed by as much as it did in the 50 years before that. So if you look at the 20th century, and divide it into periods related to the degree of global warming, you get this pattern. Between 1900 and 1940, temperatures were rising relatively rapidly, but there was a very modest rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In the next 30 years, 1940 to 1970, there was actually a small drop in temperature. Remember, I talked about global cooling at the start of my speech. The temperature at that time was actually dropping, but at the same time, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was rapidly rising. It was going in the opposite direction. And then from 1970 to 1998, both the temperature and carbon dioxide were rising strongly together. And then strangely, from 1998 to 2016, there was a pause in the rise in temperatures, which are very inconvenient for the global warming alarmists because their theories, if you take them seriously, were that there would be this inexorable rise year in and year out. But for nearly 20 years, there was no discernible rise in global temperatures at all, and yet there was a very strong rise in the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere. So it's quite clear from the history of the last 100 years alone that there is no correlation which can be discerned between the amount of carbon dioxide which is being emitted and the temperature of the planet. And if you go back for the last couple of thousand years, of course, we don't have reliable temperature measures going back to Roman times, but we know that in the Roman era, Britain was warm. In the Dark Ages, it was cold. And in medieval times, again, it was warm. And in the 17th century, it was a little ice age. If you read Samuel Pepys's diaries, he talks about frost fairs on the Thames, where they had braziers where you could buy roast chestnuts that were on the ice in the Thames. It was so cold the Thames had frozen to such a depth of ice. And so you really do wonder what's going on here, that in the light of what is plainly obvious, and in the light of our history, we have governments around the world now devoted to a policy which is plainly against the interests of the West and against Britain and other advanced industrial countries. And who is driving this? Well, you've heard of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are the people who are orchestrating this change. Now, I wouldn't say that the UN is a friend of Britain, certainly not most of the members of the UN. And this is being driven to a political agenda which has nothing whatever to do with the facts or otherwise of global warming. In the process, of course, the fashionable lefties, in particular Hollywood lefties, have signed up to this agenda wholesale. I don't know if you recall, we had this Extinction Rebellion taking place I think there's something going on this weekend in Britain, a few weeks ago, and Dame Emma Thompson appeared at a rally to protest against climate change. And, give her due, she really put herself out. She flew first class from Los Angeles in order to be there. And was pictured actually dining on champagne and beef carpaccio in a seat which cost her 18,000 quid. Yet one of her great complaints is that we all fly too much because we're emitting far too much CO2 into the atmosphere. And so it's bizarre, isn't it, that we have a collection of people, some of them who've got the power over our lives big time, we have a collection of people who are now devoted to a set of policies which is wholly at odds with the best interests of the people of this country in particular. And yet none of the political parties, apart from UKIP, is prepared to point this out. Once again, UKIP is the one who points out that the emperor has no clothes. So although Brexit was the policy which brought us all together in the first place in UKIP, that was the reason why UKIP was founded way back in the early 1990s, there are lots of other policies that UKIP has got which are unique. We have lots of USPs. So if, as we all hope, Boris does deliver at the end of October, then UKIP does have an existence and a purpose way beyond Brexit. He may not deliver, in which case we battle on, of course. But we have to plan now for a post-Brexit Britain. And not just because it will happen post-Brexit. We need to campaign this whether we're inside the EU or not, because the EU, as the driver of global warming, is the place where the policy decisions ultimately are made. When I said that Theresa May has opted for carbon neutral by 2050, she's only following EU directives, because environmental policy is one of those areas that the British government has given up its right to take decisions, unless it wants to be even more extreme than the EU bureaucrats themselves, which is what we've seen here. So I believe that there is a great future for UKIP beyond Brexit, and it's that narrative that we must now be working on. What we have to realise is that the globalist agenda consumes all the other parties, and that UKIP is the only party which truly does speak for Britain. We are the only party which truly believes that nations are the building blocks of a true world order. And therefore, not only is there a future for UKIP, there would be no future for Britain without UKIP.
Well, thank you, Neil.